Good morning, Marco.
How are you?
I'm all right, thanks.
I'll make a quick introduction in Italian and then I'll make the same in English.
Okay.
Ringrazio George Monbiot per partecipare all'incontro di oggi. Io sono Margo Magini, scrittore e attivista basato a Londra. George Monbiot è un attivista, scrittore, editorialista del Guardian e anche autore di canzoni e screenplay. Il suo libro Riprendere il controllo, nuove comunità per una nuova politica, è stato pubblicato in Italia da Treccani nell'aprile 2019. Welcome everyone. My name is Margo Magini. I'm an activist and writer who's London-based. We have here today with us George Monbiot, which I thank to join us. George Monbiot is an activist, political commentator for The Guardian, and screenplayer, songwriter, and much more. So thank George for joining us in these strange times. My first question would be, the book was originally, is the unavoidable COVID question. The book was originally written before COVID. How different, if at all, you would have write this if you would have write it now?
I think what the coronavirus has done is to really sharpen so many of the crucial questions about our relationships with each other and our relationships with the natural world. We have seen how the virus arose from our dysfunctional relationships with nature. It appears to have originated in a wet market in Wuhan, jumping from a pangolin to or a bat to a pangolin to a human being. Those bats should not have been there. Those pangolins should not have been there. The more we destroy living systems, the more we expose ourselves to zoonotic disease. I first came across this issue when I worked in the Amazon in the late 1980s and early 1990s, where the gold miners and peasant farmers I met in some places were terrified of rabies, outbreaks of rabies, which were spreading through their camps. And I was astonished by this. I thought rabies was a disease transmitted by dogs, and there weren't any dogs around. It turned out that by felling the forest, by cutting down the forests, they had deprived the vampire bats that were living on sloths and monkeys in the forest canopy of their food. And so those bats had come down to ground level and were feeding on the people instead and transmitting rabies that way. And it was the first thought I had when I heard about the origins of this pandemic. Was I saw that sort of thing happening right there, and the terror that it created. And there's a sense that this pandemic has really exposed those dysfunctional relations, but also exposed a lot of political and economic dysfunctions, particularly in my country, the United Kingdom, which totally failed to learn from Italy's experience and has made a terrible disaster out of this crisis.
There is a big sense that a big crisis is looming, which is, an economic crisis and the furlough scheme finishing in September and, mass unemployment and so on. How do we make sure, the book is very hopeful in a lot of sense. So how do we make sure that this time, compared to 2008, for example, the overall narrative, and the book speaks extensively about it, is not captured against by the right wing and the fear project?
I mean, this is a great moment, a great opportunity for radical political change. We've seen a flowering of mutual aid taking place in many nations all around the world, in fact, as people come together to help each other, to build community, out of which a new politics can grow, which is really the theme of the book, showing how by rebuilding a compassionate community, bridging networks, bringing ourselves together with people who aren't necessarily of our same background, but who we can find common cause with. We can start rebuilding politics from the ground up. And the way that people have supported each other through this pandemic really, I think, vindicates that approach and shows that it's not just a fantasy, shows that we can really do this. We've also seen that we can make massive changes when the need arises, that there are times of political trauma where we suddenly see that all the stories we've been told by politicians, that there is no alternative, this is the only way of doing things, sorry, you've got to have austerity, we can't avoid that, oh, there's nothing we can do about the homeless, they have to sleep on the streets. We find out that all those things are lies. You know, the moment they need to, suddenly they can find loads of money. The moment that homeless people are perceived as a public health risk to other people, quick, we've got to get them all off the streets and find accommodation for them. And they can do it straight away. You know, when governments want to govern, they can govern. And so you think, oh, so hang on a minute. None of these were hard truths. None of these were facts. This was just a matter of political will. You were lying about these things. You were telling us that things could not change. And yet we've discovered very readily that they can. And so we are at a moment of political crisis and a great economic crisis as well, which is a moment of great political danger because we see the far right mobilizing around the world, and the far right has always been very good at making use of crises like this. But it is also a moment of great opportunity because we can demonstrate quite convincingly that the political system in countries particularly like the US, the UK, Brazil, but also many other parts of the world is fundamentally broken. It is not serving its people. It's not working for us. And that the political class who govern us do not have our best interests at heart. They're a self-serving class rather than people who are working to defend us. So there is a great opportunity now for a new progressive politics, a politics that builds from the bottom up, a politics based on deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, that seeks to transform political systems, not just in terms of what goes on within Parliament, but from the ground up, to make them once more belong to the people rather than to the elites that have captured them.
You talk extensively in the book about the concept of restoration stories. So what would be what's the restoration stories maybe now for our listener, and what would be the post-corona potential restoration story?
Sure. So the one of the things I do in the book is to look at how political change happens. And looking back over hundreds or indeed thousands of years of political and religious transformations, of moments of great change, I see that they all have one thing in common, which is a powerful new narrative of change. And remarkably, it's not just any old narrative, but it's a narrative which almost invariably follows exactly the same narrative structure. Now, you may be aware that there are debates about how many basic narratives there are. Maybe there's 3 basic plot forms, or 5, or 7, or 9. It's always an odd number for some reason, but you know, I think we all agree that there are a number of basic narrative structures that are used again and again by storytellers in books, in films, political storytellers as well. But there's one in politics that seems to be invaluable, that it's the one that works. And this is the one I call the restoration story. And it goes as follows. Disorder afflicts the land caused by powerful and nefarious forces working against the interests of humanity. But the hero or heroes confront those powerful and nefarious forces, against the odds overthrows them, and restores harmony to the land. Now, this is a very familiar narrative story, a structure, isn't it? We see it in Lord of the Rings, we see it in Narnia, we see it in Harry Potter, we see it in the Bible. but we also see it again and again in politics, whatever that politics may be. So the Social Democrats used it. Lord Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, he used exactly that structure. The neoliberals like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, they used exactly that structure to tell exactly the opposite story to the one that Lord Keynes was using. Marx used it. Marx and Engels used it. The Nazis used it. The successful political transformations use that narrative structure. And it can be used in very positive ways, or it can be used in very negative ways, but it appears to be an indispensable component of political change. And the political failure that we confront at the moment, which could basically be summarized as that when the existing political order collapsed in 2008, and by this I mean neoliberalism and the whole structure of neoliberal thought and neoliberal action really fell apart in 2008 with the financial crisis, we had no new story with which to replace it. So instead of coming forward and saying, right, that old story has proven to be false, here's a new restoration story which shows us how to pick ourselves up and get out of this situation, we didn't have one. And by contrast to previous situations where after the Great Depression, Lord Keynes sat down and he wrote his new restoration story, his general theory, and then Hayek and others wrote their new restoration story, The Road to Serfdom, the Constitution of Liberty, in response to Keynes, and that became the new story when Keynesianism ran into trouble in the 1970s. When neoliberalism fell apart in 2008, we had produced no new restoration story with which to replace it. And so my effort really is to try to catalyze the production of that new story. And I don't want to be the sort of old man scratching his beard saying, I've got the answer, because I think that era has passed. It should have passed. You know, this is something we have to construct together. But what I think we can see is the basic lines of what that story might look like. So it would go as follows, something like this, but I want other people to build on this and to develop this story. The world has been thrown into disorder by the powerful and nefarious forces of neoliberalism, which by claiming that there is no alternative, by claiming that competition and selfishness and greed should be our dominant values, have set us against each other and atomized society. But the heroes of the story, communities coming together in mutual aid to defend each other and to rebuild politics from the bottom up, can overthrow those powerful and nefarious forces and restore harmony to the land in the form of a political and economic system that belongs to us, not to the wealthy elites. So that's the basic structure of the story, which I think, I think the momentum for that story has maybe been enhanced by what we've seen during the pandemic. But it's not a story that I want to write alone. I just want to sort of set the ball rolling or help the ball to roll, because of course a lot of people are working in this field already, and encourage people to build this story together. This is not a tablet of stone to be handed down from on high by an intellectual like myself. It's something that we as communities have to construct together.
But is it listening to you, is it just a narrative, or the ambition is a systemic change? Are we aiming at a different narrative, or are we aiming at capitalism? Or, science tells us we have not even a decade, to make sure that we don't go beyond 2 degrees. And maybe there is no time to think about systemic change, and we should more, where's the balance there?
Well, the narrative is not change itself. It's just a structure which we use to help precipitate change. A narrative is the way we talk about the crisis we face and the way we get out of that crisis. It's a necessary condition for change, but it's not a sufficient condition for change. It's just one of many elements. And of course, perhaps the most important element is actual political activism of people getting together, mobilizing as campaigners to change things. And non-violent direct action, civil disobedience is absolutely crucial to that. And alongside the pandemic, we also see another extraordinary global shift taking place following the murder of George Floyd, with this extraordinary, powerful transformation in terms of people saying enough is enough. We have had enough of being treated like second-class citizens because we are people of color. And we demand a fair system of the kind which has been denied to us for centuries. And the way that this message is now spread around the world like wildfire has been extremely encouraging, thrilling to see. You may be aware in Italy of the statue that we tipped into the water in Britain of this slave trader, Edward Colston. And the moment that happened, I thought, that looks like a tipping point to me in more than one sense. He was tipped into the water, but there's I see a massive shift in politics taking place right here, right now. And of course, all the right-wing politicians lined up to condemn this action and said it was vandalism and said this is taking the law into your own hands, which of course it was. Yes, people were taking the law into their own hands, but boy, has it worked. It's just transformed the conversation in this country. And now we see people, councils and colleges and government taking down statues without being prompted to do so, because they're so terrified of this shift that is taking place. But much more importantly than that, we are seeing this massive reassessment of our politics, of our history, of our culture, taking place right here, right now. But what I'm saying is that to make all that even more powerful, we should frame it with a narrative which helps us to get from where we are to where we want to go. That narrative becomes a vehicle in which we can start to move. Because otherwise we can find ourselves just sort of stuck in a cycle of protest and complaint and small gains and then retreat, and then protest and complaint, small gains and retreat. If we want to have steady and unreversible progress towards a new politics, we have to have a story which tells us where we are, how we got here, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. And that's why narrative is absolutely crucial to political change. Now, you quite rightly say that we have this urgency because of the collapse of our life support systems, not just as a result of climate breakdown, but also a result of ecological breakdown in general. We see this almost full spectrum collapse across all the crucial things that keep us alive. The climate, the soil, our fresh water supplies. We see massive levels of air pollution, so local air quality. We see water pollution at horrendous levels in many parts of the world. We see an almost total collapse of biodiversity taking place. So there's very little time. But the answer to that is not, let's just run around like headless chickens reacting to stuff. That means it's even more important that we do it in a systemic and structured and intelligent way. And that, I believe, requires this narrative vehicle to help us along.
And going down to the individual, a lot of people were surprised about, how such a incredible systemic change, economies putting on ice for so long, led to relatively small decrease in emissions. So one would argue, obviously, that this whole change wasn't meant to cut emissions. It was meant to, control a virus. But at the same time, this kind of a highlight an existing tension also on the left side between degrowth and, the green growth, or, all the different manifestos then from Labour to Democrats in the US are pushing. So does this change anything? And where do you stand, in the debate between degrowth and, green growth?
Well, the first thing to say is that as consumers, we can change very little. This is what we've seen from the statistics. We see this massive change in our lives, but actually very little impact on emissions. And yeah, it does help. It does help not to fly. That's really important. And it's great that so many more people are having their meetings this way than seeing 80 kilograms of human being hauled 10,000 meters into the air just to talk to somebody. I mean, how crazy is that in the 21st century? So, we're finally using 21st century tools of communication. That's fantastic. It's really important, I feel, to change our diets, to switch away from a meat-based diet towards a plant-based diet. That makes a big impact. But actually, the really big environmental changes have to be structural changes. We can't just do this through changing our consumption habits. We have to see a structural change in our economic relationships with each other and with the rest of the planet. And that means more egalitarian relationships, so we don't see a few people just grabbing vast resources for themselves. We don't kid ourselves that we can all be those people, because the only reason those people can behave like that is that everybody else does not, because they're taking it from us. There just isn't enough for everyone to have a yacht and a super home and a private jet and the rest of it. That's just theft from other people. But we also need a completely restructured economy. And that does, I believe, need degrowth in the rich nations. In poorer parts of the world, people need better conditions of life, and they need basic needs met, which aren't being met. But in the rich parts of the world, we're massively overusing the planet's resources by grabbing more and more for ourselves, particularly the richer people in our own nations. So we need a more redistributive economy, but we also need one which puts far less pressure on the living world. And that really means, I believe, an end to capitalism and the creation of new economic systems based on a far more cooperative and sharing economy.
On a personal level, reading the book, one thing that as a foreigner living in the UK, always, puts me a bit on alert is the sense of belonging, which is very important, and community building and so on. How do we create community where the sense of belonging is inclusive also, to people like me, or foreigner, and doesn't go all the way, the Farage way?
Yeah. Well, this is a really important question, because community can so easily be co-opted. Belonging can so easily be co-opted. And I think you can make a distinction between what some people call bonding networks and bridging networks. And so a bonding network is where you create a community out of people just like yourself, who might have the same background, the same class, the same skin color, the same economic status, and you build that community against other people, and you create a sort of fortress out of that community. A bridging network is where you build community with people from many diverse backgrounds, creating shared interests and mutual self-help within that network. And those are the networks we want to create. Not building community doesn't mean community goes away. It means that somebody else builds community on different lines. That's because the need to belong, the need to be part of a community, is a very fundamental human need. And we seek it out. And if it's missing, we look for it almost anywhere, and sometimes in really the wrong places. I mean, fascism could be seen as an extreme form of belonging, where everybody wears the same clothes and marches to the same music and chants the same slogans and gives the same salutes and raises the same flags. That's a search for community. That's an extreme community which has been created. So by stepping out of the arena of belonging and community, we don't make it go away. We just surrender it to Nigel Farage or to Salvini or to Le Pen or Trump or Bolsonaro or whoever it might be. So we have to instead stake out our claim to progressive, inclusive, bridging communities, which displace the need for bonding communities, which tell people you're loved, you're cared for, you're held, you're valued, without having to go and join those fascists.
being conscious of time, I have one last question with look into the future. So it's, a lot of friends are discussing, the elections in the US coming up. And, the bold question is for the planet, given that we have this small window of opportunity to mitigate the most severe impact of global warming, what hope is left in case Trump wins again?
Yeah. Well, first, we must hope that he doesn't win again and support our friends in the US to prevent that catastrophe from happening. I have to say, it's pretty depressing that his opponent is Joe Biden, who I find a profoundly uninspiring man who I think is really out of touch with a lot of the new thinking, the new progressive currents which are currently trying to transform the world. However, he seems to be the only candidate, and so I think we have to, however best we can, throw our weight behind him, and let's hope he chooses a rather more interesting running mate. But with if it does happen, if that catastrophe of Trump winning a second term does happen, then we really are in very serious trouble indeed. I mean, it's, we're looking at what is basically fascism. It's always hard to say what is fascism and what isn't fascism. The definitions are quite slippery, but the methods used are fascist. The demagoguery, the distraction, the failure to engage with fact, the whipping up of violence. I see a lot of those militias in the US who have been supporting Trump, walking into Senate houses with their guns, as potentially turning into paramilitary enforcers who could play the role effectively of fascist shock troops. It's a very, very dangerous situation indeed. But at the same time, it will trigger even more consciousness and even more grassroots building than we're seeing at the moment from the many, many groups and people who are proliferating from the Black Lives Matter campaigns. I mean, I really hope it doesn't come to this, but if it does, then we're going to need global solidarity on a huge scale.
George Monbiot, thank you very much. Out of the Rec is published in Italy by Treccani under the title Riprendere, controllo, nuove comunità per una nuova politica. And yeah, hope to talk again to you soon.
Thank you so much, Marco. Lovely to talk to you.